SpaceX has now reflown its Falcon 9 payload fairings more than 300 times, and one specific fairing half, SN185, has reached 36 flights, the highest count ever recorded in the program. We're breaking down what those numbers actually mean, how SpaceX got here, and why this matters for the economics of modern spaceflight. At the very top of a Falcon 9 rocket sits the payload fairing, a two-piece nose cone designed to shield the satellite or cargo from extreme aerodynamic pressure, violent acoustic forces, and intense heating during the first phase of launch. And once the rocket climbs high enough, roughly 3 minutes into flight, those conditions disappear and the fairing splits cleanly into two halves that fall away. Each half stands about 13 meters tall and stretches 5.2 meters across, built from carbon fiber composite wrapped around an aluminum honeycomb core, which keeps the structure both light and strong, while the mass of a single half comes in at roughly 1,900 kilograms. Now here's where things get expensive, because a full pair of fairings cost about $6 million to produce, which works out to around 10% of the total cost of a Falcon 9 launch. And for decades, from the early days of Sputnik through the 2010s, that entire structure did its job for just a few minutes before being discarded, either burning up on re-entry or sinking into the ocean. Think about that at scale, because SpaceX now conducts well over 100 Falcon 9 launches each year, which means the traditional model would have thrown away hundreds of millions of dollars in fairing hardware annually. And that context is exactly why recovery and reuse became such a focus. The first real push toward fairing recovery began in 2017, when SpaceX started testing a system that equipped each half with cold gas thrusters for orientation and a steerable parafoil that could guide it back down through the atmosphere, slowing the descent enough to survive intact. Back in March 2017, during the SES-10 press conference, Elon Musk described the plan in a way people still remember, talking about landing the fairings on what he called a floating bouncy castle. And while that idea sounded almost playful, the actual solution turned into something much more mechanical. That concept evolved into a fast-moving ship fitted with a massive net, and SpaceX modified a vessel called Mr. Steven by adding 4 extended arms with a net spanning nearly 40,000 square feet, turning it into what was essentially a giant catcher's mitt at sea. Attempts throughout 2018 kept missing the mark, sometimes by just a few meters, sometimes because of shifting winds or rough ocean conditions, and even helicopter drop tests in October of that year failed to produce a confirmed success, which meant progress felt slow at first. Everything changed in June 2019, when the ship, now renamed M-Tree after being acquired by Geese Offshore, finally caught a fairing half during the Falcon Heavy STP-2 mission on June 25, and that moment marked the first successful net recovery. A second catch followed on August 6, 2019, during the Amos 17 mission, and with momentum building, SpaceX brought in a second ship, Miss Chief, aiming to catch both halves of a fairing in a single launch, which finally happened on July 20, 2020, during the Anasis 2 mission. What stands out is what happened next, because despite achieving those milestones, SpaceX walked away from the net system entirely by April 2021, with the final successful catch taking place in October 2020, and both recovery ships retiring shortly after. The reason came down to efficiency, since letting the fairings splash down in the ocean and retrieving them afterward turned out to be simpler, more reliable, and less dependent on perfect conditions. And once engineers confirmed they could clean, inspect, and reuse wet recovered fairings within 48 hours, the net system no longer made sense. By 2021, SpaceX had already begun transitioning its recovery operations, replacing the earlier ships with 2 multi-purpose vessels named Bob and Doug, honoring astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken from the Demo 2 mission, and then in February 2022, adding 2 smaller fast boats called Maverick and Goose to speed up retrieval operations. Around late 2020, fairing recovery had already become a standard part of most Falcon 9 satellite launches, and within a year, reused fairings were flying on the majority majority of missions, which marked a major shift in how launches were conducted. Once a fairing is pulled from the ocean, it heads straight to a SpaceX facility where teams clean off saltwater exposure and dry the structure within 48 hours to prevent corrosion. And after that, technicians run non-destructive tests like ultrasound scans to detect cracks or hidden damage in the composite material. Repairs happen when needed, though they are limited to no more than 10% of the surface area to preserve structural integrity. While the parafoil system gets repacked, the cold gas thrusters are refilled, and every 5 flights, the fairing undergoes a full overhaul that includes deeper structural checks and component replacements. Turnaround times kept improving, and by 2025, most fairings could be refurbished and ready to fly again within 2 to 3 weeks, with the fastest recorded turnaround dropping to just 9 days between splashdown and relaunch. The numbers tell the story clearly, because the first reflight happened on November 11th, 2019, and by October 2022, during the Crew 5 mission, the program had reached around 100 cumulative reflights. Then, by February 2025, that number climbed to 307 during a Starlink Group 710 mission, and by November 2025, it had already passed 400, while as of April 7th, 2026, the confirmed total sits above 300 and continues to rise with nearly every launch. SN-185 entered service in 2022, and despite being a relatively recent addition to the fleet, it has already reached 36 flights, making it the most reflown fairing half currently in operation. That milestone took shape in May 2025, when SN-185 became the first fairing half ever to reach 30 flights, and SpaceX marked the moment publicly, confirming fairing deployment while noting the historic count. Tracking continued beyond that point, and thanks to serial number decals added to fairings in late 2024, observers could follow SN-185's progress as it kept flying, eventually reaching 36 missions by the time of the Starlink 678 launch. For comparison, SN-168 follows behind with 33 flights, while SN-152, the oldest active fairing still in service, continues flying as of early 2026, which shows just how long these components can remain operational. SN-185's 36 flights actually exceed the reuse record for Falcon 9 boosters, with booster B1067 currently holding that record at 34 flights as of April 2026, meaning the fairing has quietly surpassed the rocket stage itself in total missions. That outcome wasn't something SpaceX set out to prove, but it reflects how reliable the fairing refurbishment process has become, allowing individual halves to accumulate more flights than the boosters they accompany. Public data on fairing histories remains limited since SpaceX does not routinely publish detailed records, and most of these counts come from milestone announcements and compiled launch data, including sources like Wikipedia's Falcon 9 launch records. A single pair of fairings costs about $6 million to build, and with SpaceX aiming for roughly 140 to 145 Falcon 9 launches in 2026, according to Gwen Shotwell, that translates into between 280 and 290 fairing halves flown in just 1 year. Under the old model, every one of those halves would have been discarded after a single flight at a cost of $3 million each, which quickly adds up to hundreds of millions in hardware losses annually. Elon Musk has mentioned that refurbishing a booster costs less than 10% of building a new one, and while that figure applies directly to boosters, the fairing program follows a similar pattern, where refurbishment costs remain only a fraction of manufacturing. At that scale, even small savings per flight compound into massive reductions in total launch cost, and those savings play a direct role in making projects like the Starlink constellation financially viable. There's also a deeper engineering story here, because when a fairing half flies 36 times without a reuse-related failure, it demonstrates that carbon composite structures can survive repeated cycles of hypersonic re-entry, ocean exposure, cleaning, inspection, and relaunch with a level of reliability that earlier generations of aerospace engineers did not expect. 9 days. That's the fastest turnaround recorded, and it brings rocket hardware closer to airline-style operations than traditional spaceflight timelines. airlines. More than 300 reflights and a 36-flight record for SN-185 tell the story of a program that started in 2017 with an idea described as a floating bouncy castle, moved through years of missed catches and experimentation, shifted strategies completely, and ended up redefining how rocket components are used. SN-185 alone has flown 36 times since entering service in 2022, surpassing even the most used Falcon 9 booster, while continuing to operate without failure across repeated missions. Fairings like SN-152 remain active years after their introduction, and the entire system now runs as a standard part of SpaceX operations rather than an experimental effort. What began as a recovery experiment has become a core piece of the company's approach, lowering launch costs, enabling large-scale satellite deployment, and proving that hardware sent to the edge of space can return, be prepared again, and fly once more, hundreds of times and counting.